Good morning. Annie Sego Buzu. I'd like to acknowledge that Queen sits, and I'm gracious to be here, that it sits on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. And I'd like to thank Jan, too, for her opening. The first time I heard the Haudenosaunee words before all others, it was Jan that I believe spoke them. And I've heard them many times since, and I always find that I'm able to relax a little bit when I hear them, usually, because they're always held at meetings, usually. I wasn't able to relax quite so much today because I knew I had to speak to you, but it certainly always helps. I'm going to be speaking about doing business with First Nations, and before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge that there are some people in the room that have extensive experience, and Danby and Samantha with the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, from a research and working with First Nation business perspective. And certainly during the last week, I became well acquainted with your research and your website. And I have to look into becoming a member now. But there's also industry partners here who are doing work with First Nations, and they're on the ground, and they have a terrific perspective, and I kind of look forward at the end of the session to learning from industry partners, from Samantha and Danby, and also David Heineman, who I just met earlier today. He is the industry partnerships here at Queen's University. And it got me thinking that, there's a lot to learn, and I'll bet you that David has a lot of insights in terms of doing business with First Nations, even though perhaps you're not doing business with First Nations right now. So maybe at the end of the session we can have, maybe I'll put the question out now, and that is for you to begin thinking about what in your experiences has worked well, and what are some of the traps and pitfalls to beware of in terms of working with First Nations. Before getting started too, I just wanted to say I focused on First Nations, but a lot of what I have to say in my presentation is applicable to Indigenous people in general, but there are some very specific First Nation parts of the presentation, and I'll try and point those out as we go along. This was just this week on Monday, a headline. In business since 6000 BC. And this is the Coquitlam First Nation out in British Columbia. They had a press release, and I'll just read you the opening paragraph, because I know it's small and a lot of you won't be able to read it from there, but it says, Coquitlam First Nation have been the guardians of the Coquitlam River watershed for more than 8,000 years and are committed to economic development to promote the self-determination and long-term growth of the nation. The nation is hosting an open house to share information about their cultural heritage, a new comprehensive health and wellness center, and the unprecedented industrial development opportunity. And what I wanted to highlight from that, besides the 6000 BC, in business in 6000 BC, which I thought was great, I thought 2 points come out of here, and that is that they've been the guardians of the Coquitlam River watershed for 8,000 years. And their commitment to economic development is to promote the self-determination and long-term growth of the nation. And you'll see later that when I talk about some of the differences between perhaps commercial mainstream and First Nations, First Nations are environmental stewards, and they're looking at business and economic development for their communities and for building their nations. And it just came through so clearly in this press release. So why do business with First Nations? An emerging market right here in Canada. And some of this information I got from the CCAB website, and others I pulled from Statistics Canada and so on. But what I wanted to point out is that nationwide, the income of Aboriginal households, businesses, and band councils will climb to $32 billion by 2016. I wasn't able to verify if that was the case or not, but that represented a 50% growth rate in 5 years. And has been pointed out already, the median age of First Nations people in 2011, it was 26 years old, versus 41 for the rest of Canada. All pointing to significant growth. Coincidentally, the 2016 Statistics Canada information is due out on Aboriginal peoples, is due out next month, about a month from on October the 25th. So had we been a month later in this workshop, we'd have, you know, I would probably expect to see a lot of the numbers go up. So an emerging market opportunity right here in Canada. The call to reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had, I think, 94 calls to action. Number 92 is a call to the corporate sector in Canada. The corporate sector to work with First Nations people, to commit to meaningful consultation, building respectful relationships, and obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. And the second part of that was to ensure that Aboriginal peoples have equitable access to jobs, training, and education opportunities in the corporate sector, and that Aboriginal communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. The National Aboriginal Economic Development Board estimates that by closing the productivity gap that exists between Canada's Indigenous and non-Indigenous population, $27.7 billion would be added to Canada's economy. So it's time, we seem to be at a crossroads. It's time to include First Nations in the mainstream commercial activity in Canada. And it fits right in and is a concrete step towards reconciliation. It's a smart business strategy for the reasons mentioned. Access to growth, access to resources, labor force, procurement. And when doing business with First Nations and Aboriginal communities, it's all about relationships, and those relationships pay dividends down the road. So it's just a smart business strategy. And lastly, and I think Danby and Samantha intoned this, First Nations are open for business. You know, I say this generally, not perhaps every single First Nation, but in general, they're open for business. They realize increasingly that economic development is the road to nation building and self-determination and sustainability. They're looking to build wealth, and they're looking to participate in the commercial mainstream. So I probably didn't tell you anything you didn't know. What I wanted to talk about a little bit now was some of the differences between Aboriginal or Indigenous business and commercial mainstream business. And you know, I've titled this slide Profit Motivation Plus, and what that means is that First Nation business is of course interested in profit, but they have a list of other things that are that they're motivated by as well. So economic development, sustainability, environmental protections, building the capacity of their business, of their community, seeing spin-off benefits in the community from the economic activity. Mark mentioned this earlier, the seventh generation. So they're in it for the long game. Their decision making is looking forward to the seventh generation and the impacts of their decisions being taken today, generations down the road. And this impacts not only their decision making, but the speed as well. And that's a significant difference. Just a little aside, this summer I met a good friend of mine who I hadn't seen in 30 years. We went to high school together. And she works in corporate Canada, publicly listed company out west, and in a utility company, and she's a lawyer. And we were talking about First Nations and reconciliation and these types of things. And she kind of recounted her frustration that, she's on the phone on conference calls with First Nations on legal matters, utility, consultation, whatever it might be. And of course, she's in a public company, so monthly results, quarterly results, keeping to the plan. And she's looking to make immediate progress. And I know her, and she hasn't changed in 30 years. She's type A. And she's describing to me, get on with it when she's on the telephone. So this is kind of where it comes from. They're going to take their time to respect the seventh generation. Danby and Samantha mentioned access to capital. So it's a big problem. I used to work with the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation Association, which is an association of member Aboriginal financial institutions across Canada that were developed specifically to assist First Nation businesses to access capital. And the reason that they can't, or not that they can't, that they have difficulty accessing capital is largely structural in terms of the Indian Act. So Section 89 of the Indian Act provides protection for the real and personal property of an Indian or an Indian band on a reserve from seizure, mortgage, charge, pledge, etc. So it's difficult for a non-reserve business or for a band to put up collateral. As a consequence, financing that they do get is pretty short term, interest rates are high, the terms and conditions are not as favorable as in the commercial mainstream. There's other issues that get in the way of accessing capital, such as possible equity deficiencies. There's no home ownership per se on reserves. And often there's missing business documentation, like business cases or feasibility studies. The other difference is the form of business organization. By and large, First Nation businesses are sole proprietorships. And again, it's structural. They're incentivized to be sole proprietorships if they're working on reserve. The Indian Act, Section 87 this time, protects that portion of income, of a status Indian's income, that is tax exempt. In order for it to be tax exempt, that income has to be connected to a reserve, which one of the strongest connecting factors is where the economic activity takes place. So what this means then is that a corporation doesn't enjoy or is not exempt from income tax under Section 87. And neither would the dividends coming from the corporation. So there's, and as well, the personal property protection from seizure is also, as I mentioned just a minute ago, protected under the Indian Act, but not that of a corporation. So there's a structural incentive, golden handcuffs almost, if you will, to set up your form of business organization as a sole proprietorship. Oh, I just as an aside, last week too in the news, in the New York Times, so it was an American example, but I think it has implications for Canada. There was a write-up of a big pharmacy company, and I forget the name of it, but one of the billion-dollar publicly listed, publicly traded big pharma companies in the States that had transferred to Akwesasne in New York State, not the Canadian part of Akwesasne. They had transferred patents that were under dispute to protect those patents. And it got me thinking, wow, why didn't they transfer it to a Canadian First Nation? Because and I'm not a lawyer and I don't know all the implications, but the structural protections of afforded property either owned by a band or by a status Indian person are in the legislation here in Canada. So you can see also the innovation that's taking place in the business world. So other challenges and opportunities working with First Nations, that of community support or a social license. And I recognize that there can be all kinds of different business relationships. There can be a supplier relationship. There can be a partnership. It could be construction projects. It could be mining extraction. I mean, not all of these challenges and opportunities will fit every case, but just in general. Another challenge, First Nation governance and politics. Elections happen every 2 to 3 years. And plus, if there isn't an economic development corporation, there's often the intermingling of business and politics in business decisions. Access to technology and broadband, the remote locations we talked about, and the regulatory uncertainty around jurisdiction and bylaws and et cetera are all unique challenges as well as opportunities. The third part really of my presentation is doing business with First Nations, how to do that. And I kind of pulled together a lot of information, including some of my own experience. But this is really where I think industry and the Canadian Council on Aboriginal Business might have some real insights to add as well. But demonstrating respect is big. Cultures, languages, traditions, on the decision-making processes and protocols, their history, doing your homework, so understanding the First Nation that you might be working with or the community that you might be working with, their governance, their political context, understanding their business goals. I would add to that now. I would say not just their business goals, but their economic development goals for the community and their community goals and how they all interrelate. Ongoing consultation and engagement and communication and not at the last minute. And along the way to identify those obstacles and challenges that will have to be bridged somehow in terms of a working relationship. Building trust and building relationships is so important to First Nations people and Indigenous people in general. And how do you do that? Well, you be there. You participate in their cultural events and important celebrations that are appropriate to attend, of course. Perhaps sponsoring events or activities, collaborating, and building consensus to solve problems and identify opportunities. To be in their corner, to promote the First Nation you're working with, or First Nations in general. You can see here I've got, get involved with national and regional associations. And I know to the industry partners here today, I'm preaching to the converted. But sponsoring, speaking, getting involved with trade shows, participating in research projects. Be visible in terms of building that trust and those relationships. Be consistent. When it gets down to the nitty-gritty of business or project planning, proposing business ideas or partnerships or joint ventures. And David and I were talking this morning at breakfast, and I was asking him about his role with industry and Queens, and his job is linking the two up, because often, he said, one side or the other doesn't know what they don't know. And it's so true here. I mean, First Nations don't know what they don't know, and industry and business have a keen insight and have a lot to teach. And they can see the bigger picture often. And so to propose ideas and partnerships and joint ventures, I think is key. Respecting oral traditions. So there's always a contract or an agreement or a multitude of documentation. It's critical that you talk through these documents, especially those important terms or those important mutual expectations that you have of one another. And it's It's because First Nations people have oral traditions, and it's critical to talk these things through. Addressing the sustainability of a project. I've seen too many times, and I remember specifically a swimming pool that had been built in a First Nation. And it got built, and there was a great celebration, and 2 years later, couldn't fund the maintenance of it. There's nobody who's trained in maintaining a pool or maintaining the building, and they had to close it down. There's no, the time for planning that is at the project onset to make sure that it's going to be sustainable after the project is finished and you leave. Designing, when it does come down to writing the agreements, designing mutually beneficial agreements, addressing those opportunities, addressing the risks of the project. Planning to minimize environmental and development impacts. The time to do that is not at the end of the project, but to get it into the agreements and the memorandums of understanding, et cetera, at the beginning. And also considering access to capital and financing innovations, and realizing, and that goes back to that access to capital issue I mentioned, and considering, First Nations want to be in the mainstream. They want to be owners. They want to have equity interests. They want to share revenues. I call this the camping rule. You probably heard of it. Leave the site better than when you found it. So in your projects, in your business with First Nations, how can you leave the community, the business better than when you first started with them? So that's through hiring, that's through procurement, that's through perhaps insisting that your commercial mainstream partners have diversity programs and set aside procurement programs. Secondments for management and professionals. Back in a prior life, I did audits internationally, and I remember whenever I went into a foreign country, part of the arrangement or the agreement, and I was far removed from this, but was that we would have a local auditor join us on our team and work with us throughout that audit, which usually lasted a month to 6 weeks. And I reflect back on that fondly because they brought energy to the team. They were our champion locally in a foreign country that we didn't understand. Like, there's parallels to be drawn. They were our guide. And I think that it was a mutually beneficial arrangement. So I put that down, and what I was thinking is secondments for people working in First Nation governments or First Nation nonprofit organizations, things like that, so that they can see and gain exposure to the commercial mainstream. And likewise, you'll see the benefits as well, as much as I described with my auditing experience. This one here too, I've worked in a number of First Nation organizations and with First Nation organizations, and when something new comes along, they're generally not set up or have funding to be able to handle it. So to the extent that you're able to assist with their own internal capacity to take on a new job, in addition to their desks with their daytime jobs, and to provide assistance for their own legal analysis and things like this, because they don't get funding from INAC to do these things. INAC being the Ministry of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. And then on an ongoing basis, it's really maintaining the relationship. It's communicating regularly. It's identifying problems as they come up and not ignoring them. And it's the continuing demonstration of respect, transparency, integrity, and consistency in being there. And that's I'm 6 minutes late. But that's my presentation. Thank you.
There are a couple of quick questions for Derek.
And I'd welcome too comments from David and from industry and from the Canadian Council on Aboriginal Business.
We'll have Merv go first and then David. And
Yeah. First of all, just like to say, you know, I think you did a really great job of your presentation and stuff. Right now, many of the things that you have on there as of impediments to business being able to access money, to borrow money, how we get collateralization, how we do all these things. So I did some of it with my business, but me, I've been in this industry for 50 years now. And what people are failing to do is recognizing Section 35 of the Constitution, which recognizes the First Nations right to self-government and also to our treaties, etc. So all the stuff that we talk about in here, Section 87, Section 89, how the Indian Act works and all these things are impediments because everybody's thinking about First Nations in the concept of Canada. And we're different, and we are a different level of government. So that means we gotta stop that, and you gotta start thinking of it. What I have done myself is I have funded schools like Casablanca School in the 90s. We borrowed $6 million from a bank, and we built the school 6 years ahead of time, and we paid it back and everything else. The other thing I'm well connected to the banking industry. In the banking industry, you know, they tell me, First Nations are our best level of clients that we have in Canada. They have never had to foreclose or go to court about non-payment of a bill. Now what we end up doing is I have access to $10 million for on a line of credit. Why we call it a line of credit? Because you can't collateralize the land on an Indian reserve. So what we end up doing is we call it a line of credit. So, and we don't call it a mortgage. So and First Nations, if you have a good level of government, then what happens is the bank recognizes that. So if they can borrow $10 million to build the houses they need today in that community, and from sources of funding that come in, they pay it back. So I have one example of that. We also have the ability to get $25 million line of credit for infrastructure, for schools, and for economic development projects that are viable. And how we end up doing it is, and we're doing it, is that the First Nation band, they, as a level of government, can borrow that money from a financial institution for collateralization, because the band can hold collateralization on individual members, whether it's for their corporations and stuff.
Yeah.
So what we end up doing there is the land title for the land, if it's a business, will be held in trust by the First Nation community until the loan is paid off. For infrastructure and that, the band can take land, develop the infrastructure as a subdivision, do it like it's done off reserve, so you have paved streets, you have sidewalks, you have underground power stuff. Then individuals buy a lot from them, and they can finance their house that way, and they can fund the infrastructure so it's done. And what happens is when, you know, the biggest impediment on this whole thing is, one, is the federal bureaucracy, and the provincial bureaucracy, and our own First Nation bureaucracy, because everybody is thinking like we're like the rest of Canada, but we're not. So with that, we need to make change, and we can do it now. And for myself, like I have a CP on my reserve. I have 97 acres on one area. Right now, I have a crew that are working clearing land and stuff that's in there. Roads are already into there. I'm going to be developing an office complex. because to own land and stuff on a reserve, you have to be a band member. So I'm a band member, so I can do that. I have Aboriginal businesses, not from my reserve, that are in nearby towns and stuff within commuting distance from it. Those Aboriginal businesses are looking at leasing office space from me to be on reserve. Now, the other aspect that you talked about was the corporation. The corporation is not an Indian, so the taxation applies to it. Well, what the Aboriginal business can do, because they're sole proprietorships and owned by them, at the end of your fiscal year, you pay back all your profits to yourself in there as a bonus.
As a salary.
It's
Yeah.
office earned on there, so
Yeah.
the corporation ends up at the end of the year in reserve profits, so it's non-taxable.
Right.
And all the profits were making it. So see.
There are
the way
ways,
you're
yeah,
thinking,
yeah.
in the way everybody else, and the way other businesses are thinking, like major corporations, what they're not, they're not looking at how it should be. You're looking at how it was 100 years ago. And that's, to me, is the biggest impediment that we have. But I don't really want to criticize what you've done, but I'm just saying, I have, with 50 years of experience, I've been working in the, not through the company, but through Merv DeWasha.
Yeah.
And we already know now how we can make major breakthroughs on just about everything that we're talking about.
Yeah, and it's a complex
Yeah.
area, and that's.
Would you like to meet with me later?
Yeah.
Yeah, so,
But it'd be a great area for the CCAB to start pursuing in terms of structuring business. Yeah.
Don't
David.
worry, my question and answer were just done.
okay. Okay, well, thanks Derek for an excellent presentation, and very much appreciated.